As I said in our introduction time, we're in the season of Lent. This is the first Sunday of Lent. You'll notice a couple of symbolic things that we probably wouldn't pick up on, except that we gather with Episcopalians, right? And so one of the gifts they give us is some of the images that maybe a lot of us don't notice or haven't grown up with. For instance, you'll notice that the two crosses in the room have been veiled. This is very intentional, and some of these things have come to be traditions throughout the Christian tradition, I suppose. And you'll notice, of course, the purple is the color of both Lent and Advent, and so that's kind of what the color is all about. But the veiling of the cross is very important, because when the cross is veiled, it reminds us that before hope, there's despair. That before hope, there's actually something we have to enter into. And I love that imagery. And so if you've noticed that today, that's kind of sort of what's going on there. Now, there's probably a beautiful history to it that I don't quite know, but that's sort of what we have as we enter the season of Lent. Lent being this time of emptying, of self-reflection, of fasting for some people. Perhaps you've already chosen, like, hey, for this 40-day period, I'm going to resist these things in this way. One of my practices right now, and it's simple, right? So some years I've been crazy, and some years I'm simple. One of my practices this year is very simple. I moved the Facebook app off of the front of my phone. I put it into its own page, and I've committed not to use the Facebook app this season. Now, why is that? Well, I'm not ridding myself of Facebook per se, but what I've noticed about my own life is that instead of being present in certain moments that feel a little more exhausted, I click and I look, and then I scroll, and then I'm scrolling, and then I'm scrolling, and then I'm scrolling, and then 40 minutes goes by, and I forgot that I had things to do, right? I forgot that in front of me was something that needed attention. And so for me, that's one way that I'm trying to resist my own inclinations. A very simple act, but perhaps it'll be very helpful during this season. Some of you are resisting food or have something going on when it comes to diet or any of these kinds of things. Some of you have some radical things that you're trying to incorporate, perhaps. But the season of Lent really invites us into those spaces that need to be confronted. And so it's kind of a somber season, but that doesn't mean we can't have some fun. And so Encounters by the Sea is both somber and fun. So let's talk about the darkness in the depths. That sounds fun, doesn't it? So I wonder if you are in a place where you could imagine that in the depths of your soul, there is stuff that, if properly excavated, would actually free you up to be a better version of who God created you to be. I wonder if you would just sit with that for a moment. Like, is there a sense within yourself that there is darkness within you? And this isn't to name you as shameful or bad. It's you've been evolutionarily predisposed to make selfish choices. We call it survival of the fittest. It is in your DNA. It is in our ancestral history. We call it sin in the Christian tradition, but you have been wired to make decisions that help you and not others. And so if you have in fact been wired this way, over time what happens is you get this sense that this impulse has accumulated baggage within you. And this baggage is something that, if not attended to, can lead to all kinds of scary stuff. In some people, it leads to some of the worst things that we've seen in human history. Now, this series isn't necessarily about the problem of evil like the series we did a few weeks ago, right? So we're not going to try and explain the problem of evil during Lent. In fact, what we're actually going to try and do and say, how does Jesus engage the problem of evil? How does Jesus invite us to actually see the seas of our world? And now you're probably wondering, what's the sea all about? Help me unpack that. And that's actually what we're going to do this morning. But I'm actually going to have Andrew help me. Andrew's going to go grab something from backstage that a few of you saw. And right here is fine. But the depths, right? How many of you like swimming during summertime? Is there a few of us? Oh, yeah, a lot of us. Yeah. some of you are transplants, so it's more natural than Seattle is, right? It's a little cold during the summer here. For me, at least, I'm used to 100 degrees, right? And I like swimming too. Like, this is more of a floaty than a pool, I think, but I bought a pool on Amazon, mostly because I get it in 2 days and it's cheap. But Lydia is convinced that this is her toy, and so we were rolling it around the house and having a good old time. But I hope we can just kind of set this here for a minute, and I want to talk about swimming for a moment. Swimming is not something I do well. Now, you've heard me talk about this maybe in the past, but I grew up with a bunch of ear problems, which oddly enough have come back to haunt me, as you know. I've been dealing with some ear stuff. I had surgery in June, and so when you have ear problems as a kid, you don't get to go into the water very much, right? You can try earplugs, but there's always this risk that something bad could happen to your inner ear hole, and that's very scientific language for inner ear hole. I didn't grow up being a good swimmer. All my friends were little guppies. My uncle, barely missed the Olympics for breaststroke, right? Was a star. Has records that have not been broken in a couple of, right? Big deal. And here I am. Man, I can't hear very well, and I've got ooze coming out of my ears half my life, right? So I don't get to so I go to swim meets, and I'm like, oh yeah, that'd be pretty cool, except I'm afraid of water, right? And so maybe there's one of you in here that's just I know what it's like to have a little bit of fear when it comes to the water. As a kid, I didn't learn how to swim until 5th grade. And that's not an exaggeration, and it's quite embarrassing, actually. I remember going to my 4th grade pool party, and the mom there inviting me to wear floaties, and I felt so much shame and embarrassment because I was like, no, I'd rather just hang out at the side or in the shallow end. Everyone knows because I can't swim very well, blah, blah, blah. So in 5th grade, right before 5th grade, the summer before 5th grade, after that pool party, my grandma took me to swim lessons, and it was very helpful to swim with kids that were 5 years old. I mean, it was super helpful. I don't know if you know this about swim lessons, but if you don't learn as a kid, often you end up with the little guys and gals, right? And so I learned how to blow bubbles, right? I learned all of these things. I held the side and I kicked, woo, right? That's really awesome when you're twice the size of every other student. And eventually, by the end of that class, I learned how to swim. And the pinnacle moment of that class was they invited us to jump off the diving boards, right? And so there was the regular diving board at that time at Dinuba High School, and then there was a high dive, which they don't really do as much in public spaces anymore. But I got on the high dive, and I stood up there for I don't even know how long. It felt like an eternity. But the idea of jumping from very high into something very deep just petrified me. And at the very end, with everyone cheering, which is so just embarrassing now that you think about it, right? You can do it, Curtis. I was Curtis until 5th grade, so this is summer before 5th grade. You can do it, Curtis. You can do it. And then I did it, and my stomach fell into my face, right? And I just went, and it was glorious. And then I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that for a while. But it was still I had taken the plunge finally. And what I hope we can do is that we can be this Lent in a posture that says, what if we actually took the plunge? What if we actually dove in spiritually? Now, this is what I wonder. I wonder if sometimes when we have these kinds of talks, we actually say we want to go deep, but what we really want is a kiddie pool, because this is convenient. I can handle this. I can sit in here a little bit, you know what I mean? Sort of. I'm stretching it kind of. Lydia barely fits in this. Apparently it's only for 3 and under. I was not very good at picking one. But we do this, and it's oh, I just went deep. I just totally went for it. And man, I now know the 5 things I need to do to be a better you, and whatever, right? And you've got your practical stuff, but at the end of it, you've gone maybe, this is probably a foot deep, right? And that's needed at times in our lives. But what I believe the scriptures and God invite us into something more involved than a kiddie pool, something more dangerous than the shallow end, something that actually requires a dive, a jump into the depths. Now, what keeps us from jumping in? Of course, we're afraid. Deep water is scary. If you've ever been in a very deep area, like you've swam in the lake, you probably know, well, I'm in a lake now, so there's a lot more danger here than even the deep end of the swimming pool, right? There's things underneath me like sharks. I don't think there's really sharks in there. But in a lake, there's little fish, trout kind of suckling your toes. And there's probably a sea monster way down there that's about to bite. If you go like 30 feet under, you're going to get bit by a dragon or something, right? Like we don't know what's under there. It's just gross and dark and people pee in it all day long, including the fish who poo in it. And you're drinking it and it's just like, oh, but it's natural, it's okay. But really it's not okay, but it's okay. And then like you start in those moments to realize that the sea, the water can actually be a very scary place. And in the biblical tradition, this is what they primarily understood. They primarily understood that the sea was a place of chaos. It's a place where the Apostle Paul, when he's describing all of his dramas, like, I was out at sea, and I got shipwrecked at sea 3 different times already. It was wonderful, right? And he somehow survives this, right? And there's this sense that the sea is an untamable force in the Bible. And sea becomes a metaphor for where the powers of evil dwell within God's good creation. Maybe you've heard of the Leviathan from the Hebrew scriptures, right? In Job, and this is like a creature that lives in the deep. It's a metaphor for the monsters of evil that want to corrupt God's good creation. And so all of us have a decision to make. We can all name that there is darkness in the depths. The question and decision, I think, has to do with this. Are we willing to confront the monsters that might be lingering below the surface? Are we willing to actually move into those spaces where the water gets colder, the habitat is unfamiliar, but we know that if we were to confront those areas of the deep, we might just find that we have the right equipment to harpoon those dragons, to say, no, the monsters don't get to win. I'm going to flourish here. But the problem is, again, the kiddie pool is much more appealing. And so what I want to invite us to do during this series is jump all the way into your pain, into your darkness, as far as your emotional posture will allow you to go, and maybe a hair further if you're sensing that God is in that space with you. Now, if God is not in the deep with you, that is a different story. But if God is in the deep with you, you might just find that you can go a hair further than you could without God. Now, I've been to a place called Israel/Palestine, and this is a beautiful place. I have this great picture of me wearing socks that aren't really ankle socks, I'm noticing here, but I was walking a lot, and so I wanted some socks, but I didn't want to stay as wide as my leg is in this picture, and so I ankled the whole tube is in my toe, and it's very uncomfortable. But it was much better than wearing Toms in the middle of summer in the Middle East and without socks, right? So this is me chilling at the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is just beautiful. I mean, it's just this gorgeous place. We got to see Jesus' hometown, and then we got to break open Bibles and just kind of hang at the edge of the sea for an hour or so. And what we're going to eventually be doing is we're eventually going to be jumping into the book of Mark, this series, right? And in Mark's gospel, the first several chapters involve Jesus kind of having the sea kind of all around him. And so that's why we call it Encounters by the Sea. It's because Jesus has all these interesting encounters by and in the sea that we don't always know exactly why the narrator's trying to highlight this beyond maybe a historical fact or something. And so this morning what I want to do is I'm going to lay this huge foundation. We're not going to go into Mark's gospel this morning, but what we're going to do is set the kind of framework for then jumping into Mark's gospel and seeing these encounters that Jesus has by the sea as something much deeper that was on purpose, much deeper than we might have assumed on a cursory reading of Mark's gospel. Are you following? So today what I want to do is I want to immerse you. Look at all these words I use and they're normal. I want to immerse you like an Anabaptist baptism. I want to immerse you in the story world of the Jewish people. And in doing so, I want you to have this thorough vision of what Jesus would have understood the sea to be, so that next week and the following weeks, when you hear the sea is nearby or they're on the sea or in the sea, you will have a vision for what's actually happening there. It's not just, hey, let's go hang out by the water because we want a tan. There's something very profound happening in the sea. So what I'm going to do this morning, actually, it starts out, I'm going to borrow, and sometimes I borrow explicitly, and this is where I'm borrowing explicitly. There's a scholar named Peter Enns. He does Hebrew Bible mostly. He's at Eastern University now, and Peter Enns has written several good books. I'll just throw you some very helpful ones. The Evolution of Adam is excellent, if you're ever wondering about science stuff, which, by the way, we're dealing with in about 6 weeks during The Science of Scripture series, which follows Easter, where we're going to get nerdy like nerdy has never, anyway, it's going to be good. And then he has other books, Inspiration and Incarnation, where he's trying to say, we can read the Bible with honest intellectual eyes and still affirm that God somehow had a part of it. And so that's a great other book of his. He's got others that are really good as well. But Peter Enns is part of this organization called BioLogos. And BioLogos has these really helpful articles. And this is one that was from back in the day. It's called Yahweh, Creation, and Cosmic Battle. What I want us to do this morning is have a picture of the cosmic battle that a good Jewish person would know intuitively. So here's what we have in Psalm 104. This is all ripped from this article. So if there's things without quotation marks, it's Peter Enns' words. If they have quotation marks, they are Scripture's words, okay? And there's just a couple slides of this. I'm not going to do this all day, I promise. But here's a really important one. Psalm 104:7 says this. It says, "At your rebuke, the waters fled." Interesting, right? Why bring up the waters? Well, this is not talking about low tide at the beach. Ha ha ha, such a funny guy when he writes his article. Without raising a hand, the waters scampered away and were defeated. Now, if you were a good Jewish person, where would you remember the first time waters were scattered? Think about it. Huh? I only have one ear that's working because I have another surgery coming up. What? Thank you. There it is. Yeah, thank you. Exodus. Okay, good. So Exodus, right? The waters will part, and this is going to become very important this morning. So the psalmist is kind of reflecting on this. Now, I'm going to give you a little nerd intel really quick, okay? So can we do, yeah, you already know. Okay, so in the ancient world, there were all kinds of gods. Yahweh, as God would come to be known, was one of many gods. And actually in the biblical worldview, what happens, you see kind of an evolution. Monotheism is a late sort of development in the biblical tradition. It's actually, if you read the earliest chapters of, or the earliest books of the Bible, what you have is something where God, the God of Israel, is the highest of all the gods, and there's this kind of hierarchy, and all of these other gods, these non-Jewish gods, are less than. They're part of this council of heaven. What eventually ends up happening is that these become attributed with demonic power. And so what used to be called gods are now understood as demonic forces. Are you tracking with this, how this tradition gets fleshed out? We're always figuring out what reality really is, right? And so they start here, but they start to understand, wait, so the Canaanite god Baal is actually empowered by the Satan. And this is demonic. This is a demonic force. Eventually, you get some voices in the biblical tradition saying, that's not even a god at all. That's not even a creature at all. And that's kind of the negotiation process of figuring out what it means to be Jewish. Now, what's really fascinating is that the Canaanite god Baal defeats a god called Yam. Can you say Yam? Yam, yes, Yam. And this god is known as also the sea. So Yam equals sea. In fact, what we're going to see here in these next passages is that the word for sea in Hebrew is Yam. Isn't that fascinating? You follow in this logic for a minute. So the Canaanite god Baal defeats Yam, and Baal becomes like the god for the Canaanites, and Yam still exists but is defeated and is a lesser god. Well, the biblical tradition picks up this rhetoric and actually says, Yam, the sea, is the thing that God conquers because Yam becomes associated with evil. So in Psalm 89, it says this, Yahweh rules, here's a quote, over the surging sea and crushed Rahab. Job 9:13 says, the cohorts of Rahab cowered at Yahweh's feet. And continuing on, Psalm 74 says, Yahweh, quote, split open the sea, Yam, broke the heads of the monsters in the waters, crushed the heads of Leviathan. A Leviathan, again, one of these monsters that lives in where? Yam, right? Following? Okay. I know this is weird, right? It's super weird. We're going to get somewhere, I promise. So we start with kiddie pools to warm you up a little bit, like, oh, that's so funny, ha. And then we go into like, huh? And then we're going to go to, ah. Okay, so that's like how this works here usually, okay? So it's like, oh, I feel some tension, but at least there was some lighthearted humor there. Oh, my brain has to be turned on Sunday. I don't work on Sunday. To, okay, so we're in, okay, now, what we need to notice, and I'm going to quote Peter Enns here. He says, likewise, the entire Exodus narrative is one big cosmic battle scene. All of these passages are trying to get us to think not of like specific individual like little conflicts, but of the cosmic battle between God and the powers of evil. Are you following? So when you get to the Exodus story and all these plagues are happening and all this stuff is going on, every plague can be correlated in one way or another to the cosmic battle that God is waging on behalf of God's people who are slaves. Are you following? And so as we continue forward, all of this imagery about defeating the sea has Exodus overtones, okay? The sea will be split. Let my people go. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, here we are. So now, let's tease this out. We're going to go to the Exodus story because if we don't, well, we'll miss some awesomeness, okay? So here we are. We're in Exodus chapter 14, 21 through 29. This is what it says. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord pushed the sea back by a strong east wind all night, turning the sea into dry land. The waters were split into two. The Israelites walked into the sea on dry ground. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians chased them and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry. By the way, horses, chariots, and cavalry, anytime a nation starts to acquire these things, you know that they're trying to be the next empire on the block. That is also biblical tradition, one we'll talk about sometime when we talk about Solomon, because what does he do? He acquires horses and chariots and decides that security needs to be elsewhere. You follow? So this is very intentional language. Verse 24. As morning approached, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian camp from the column of lightning and cloud and threw the Egyptian camp into panic. The Lord jammed their chariot wheels so that they wouldn't turn easily. The Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. I would be scared too. 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water comes back and covers the Egyptians, their chariots, and their cavalry. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. At daybreak, the sea returned to its normal depth. The Egyptians were driving toward it, and the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. So where does God think the proper location of slaveholders who are oppressing Israel is? With Yam and all the rest of the evil monsters. Fascinating, right? We hear that and say, oh my goodness, God was so mean to the Egyptians. But in this story, God is declaring that God's people are worthy of being liberated. And anyone who wants to confront that liberation with more shackles, with more slavery, with more bricks to be laid, these are the ones who have engaged in cosmic battle with me, and they do not get to win the cosmic battle. Back to the sea with it. Very fascinating. If we go to 28, it says, the waters returned and covered the chariots and the cavalry and Pharaoh's entire army that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. The Israelites, however, walked on dry ground through the sea. If you get anything out of this morning, here's what I want you to get. It is possible for you to walk on dry ground and not be consumed by the seas within you and the seas of our world. It is possible that you, in step with God, empowered by God's Spirit, do not have to let the waters consume you. That where water seems to be rushing and messy and Yam seems to be in charge, God pushes against Yam and says, there is dry, fertile ground in front of you. Walk in it. I am for you. I'm for your flourishing. So the defeat of the sea is the defeat of evil. We see this in the cross, by the way. Have you ever wondered why there's a bunch of Exodus imagery in all of the Gospels? Passover language and all of this stuff. It's all embedded in there because Jesus is understood to be a new Moses, a new liberator who is freeing the people from the sea of empire and from the sea of spiritual exile. As they wander around and wonder if God is ever going to do anything fresh like God used to do back in the day before they were sent to Babylon, if you know that story. And so this tradition of God defeating evil has to always be in the back of our minds if we want to understand how God talks about evil, even through Jesus, even in the New Testament era. The sea is defeated, thus freedom is possible, both spiritual and physical. I remember as a high school student, I was reading the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And there's another story where this happens, by the way. It's in Joshua. And we don't like Joshua, especially as Anabaptist Mennonite types, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that happens there, like killing everyone. Everyone, right? That's not our deal. We have all kinds of hermeneutical strategies for wrestling with that, right? And we're not dealing with that today. There's a 1,500-page book by Gregory Boyd that just is about to come out. Read it and tell me about it because that's a lot of work. Sorry, Greg, if you're listening. You tried hard. Good for you. This story repeats itself when they go into the land. There's another body of water that needs to be parted. Joshua parts it. They go in, and the same phrase is used again. They walked on dry land. I just love that image. And now it's not on dry land like deserty land, but what you find beneath the water is life, is possibility, is nourished soil. In fact, since we're being nerdy, right? So hold on. We're all still nerdy. Are we good? This is going to push the nerd button. You ready? In the apocryphal book of the Wisdom of Solomon, which we've never quoted from the Apocrypha before, this is what it says. The Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 19. And to give you an idea why we would quote from this, it's not inspired, but it is useful for teaching, as Luther would teach, right? Thank you, Luther, for giving us that caveat. And the Apocrypha are all of these sorts of books that early Jewish people would be fully familiar with and would draw theology from. They just don't eventually make it into the final cut. Does that make sense? And so we have to wrestle with some of why this got in and that didn't get in. But eventually, there are these books that don't make the final cut, but they are informing the worldview of Jesus. Jesus would have quoted the Wisdom of Solomon probably in temple. They knew some of these books. Now, we also don't think it was actually written by a guy named Solomon, at least not the Solomon we're thinking of. So there's interesting things we could have a conversation about. But in the Apocrypha, this is what it says. And I love that the Common English Bible, by the way, translated this. So this is super. Here's what it says. A cloud appeared, casting its shadow over their camp. Dry land appeared, where before there had been only water. It presented them an open path through the Red Sea, a grassy plain where before there had only been violent turf. So as the wisdom of Solomon starts to reflect on the Exodus story, they want you to just really get the idea that when God breaks open the water, it is good news. There is stability, there is beauty, there's the potential for life. If liberated from its bondage to evil, the sea bottom is fertile land. Again, metaphor, right? All of this is metaphor. All of this is layered language. But what we want to note is that there are spaces within the sea, within the chaos, where God can meet us. And it will be as though we are walking in step on those beautiful grassy hills we read about in Psalm 23, those green pastures that we all long for. I wonder where you have experienced moments, if we stick in the metaphorical layer for a moment, where there was a ravaging sea all around you, but you know that in one of the moments where that was true, God broke through, and it was as though you were walking on something fertile for the first time in that area. Have you ever had a moment where things were just like messy and big and Yamish? Not Amish, Yamish, new word. And then all of a sudden, fertility was right in front of you, and beauty and flowers, and you were able to walk the path. The waters may still be next to you, but they're not consuming you. God has carved a way forward for you. I wonder if you have ever seen the way in which the fertileness of God's good intention for this world works. Maybe you've seen it in the kindness of a stranger, and the love and innocence of a small child who is just over the top kind, and you don't even know what it's like to be that over the top kind. Or a friend who goes above and beyond just to demonstrate that you have value. Or the parent who named you as good and beautiful. Or the selflessness of someone you didn't expect to actually be selfless. And in all of these kinds of moments, you knew that God was breaking through the waters and there was something fertile to walk on here. And if you had your choice, you would walk on that forever. That if you had your choice, the waters would be pushed back, the monsters would be out of the way for the rest of your life. I want to suggest this morning that we can experience the liberation, the freedom that only comes when God does something we can't do by ourselves. Parts waters, walks us through the most painful situations, and says, I am with you. Now, if you think about the Moses encounter, let's think about this for a moment. Moses had to raise his staff and part the waters in one sense. So Moses played a part. But God did the actual sea thing, didn't he? So we have a part to play, but it's not all by ourselves. And in fact, Moses wasn't just hanging out with Moses. What we find out is there's a guy named Aaron that's doing some stuff. There's a community around him, and it's a shared project to walk on fertile land. The sea bottom can be tamed. And so with that kind of backdrop, we now enter into the story of Jesus a little bit, and we want to talk about Jesus and the sea. And as I said earlier, Jesus comes to tame the waters of chaos. And perhaps you already have a story in your mind where that is explicitly done, where Jesus literally speaks and the sea quivers into calm. I want to read a quote by someone who's smart named N.T. Wright, who frames this for us very well. This is what Wright says. He says, the Gospels also tell the story in terms of the deeper, darker, demonic forces which operate at a supra-personal level. In other words, they're personal, but they're beyond personal. These forces operate through all of the human elements I've mentioned. So this is part of a longer speech he's giving at Seattle Pacific University about 7-8 years ago. But cannot be reduced to terms of them. The stormy sea, the miniature but deadly tsunamis on Galilee evoke ancient Israelite imagery of an evil which is more than the sum total of present wrongdoing and woe. Like the Exodus from Egypt or the return from Babylon, only now with fully cosmic reach, God has rescued his people from the dark powers of chaos. The sea monsters have done their worst, and God has vindicated his people and put creation to rights. And he has done so through the suffering of Israel's representative, the Messiah. If we're to understand this like crazy broad worldview that Jesus steps into, it is in Jesus, Israel's representative, that we see the sea being confronted in cosmic battle one last time. The cross is where Jesus defeats these forces, and the return of Jesus signals their end. You know, Jesus confronts the sea in systems and in people, and this is what I hope we also take away. That it's possible to walk on dry land, but to understand the seas as being both personal and external. And let me not ruin the ocean view for you for a moment here. I'm thinking about this a little bit. Like if you've ever stood devotionally at the edge of the world and looked out at the Pacific, and when we do that, we see mountains because of the sound, which is kind of cool and kind of a bummer. But let's pretend the sound isn't mountainy, and we're just at the edge of the water. And all we see is glass. All we see is water. All we see is the horizon. Being on the shore and seeing the waters, that is also something the Bible will affirm over and over again. In fact, there's this phrase in the Bible about the waters covering the sea, as though the waters are good, but the sea is bad. It's very fascinating, right? So there's like this layer to the imagery, and of course we don't want to over-literalize it. So when you look at the ocean, it is beautiful, it is good. But if you get down there far enough, there might be some monster that some guy with a harpoon hook is going to find someday. I'm imagining, I don't know, like a peg leg and a pipe. Is that weird? Yeah. But what we got to understand about the sea is that Jesus confronts it in people. So like, as I've said, it's within you. It's all around you. It's both and. And so there are the seas of racism in our culture. There are the seas of injustice. There are the seas of exclusion. There's a sea of war. There's a sea of disease. And there's a sea within you that is raging for your affection, raging for your allegiance every single day. And what Jesus says is you can confront both. But if you neglect one for the sake of the other, you've missed the Jesus who confronts both kinds of raging waters. In fact, we get to the end of the Bible, and this is what it says. This is so, like, if anything, like, clicks for you for the first time, I hope it's this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the former heaven and former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Why in the world does Jesus hate the ocean so much? No! In God's recreated world, there is no room for evil because evil has been purged from God's good world. The fact that there is no sea in the New Jerusalem imagery is beautiful news. There is no longer any sea. There are no more monsters to be tamed. The monsters within you and the monsters around you have all been dismissed from God's good world. And so I hope that we can just say one thing, that we will live as though the sea has actually already been tamed. Can we be people who live as though the depths of evil, the darkness, the sea that for generations the Hebrew people long to see destroyed has already decisively lost the battle, and that the cosmic forces that push against us every single day, in fact, although we feel their wrath now, will not always have the opportunity. The sea is on death row awaiting their final day, and we're not on that. We're on the path of eternity. What does it look like for you to name your sea during this Lent? What does it look like for you to say, I realize that I don't have it all together, that there are things within me warring against what God wants for me and for this world? And then to say, I don't have to name it as though I'm this terrible, awful, yucky person. I get to name it knowing fully that the cross is decisively where God defeats evil because of grace. It is God's grace that ultimately gets the last word. And it is God's grace that ultimately can tame the seas within you. And Lent is your opportunity, my opportunity, to confront one of those raging monsters within us. And remember and remind them, Jesus already took care of this. So what does it look like for me to sit with Jesus, to see it taken care of here, now, in this moment, forever?